What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you with another 23-24 NBA look ahead. We are joined by, as always, when we talk about the Charlotte Hornets, Kanata Edwards. He is an Eye on College Basketball podcast producer for CBS Sports, does other things for them as well. He's now a frequent returning guest and friend of the podcast. So he's here by his own volition. It is his own mistake. We are always excited to have him. Follow him on Twitter at Nata the Scribe. That's at NATATHESCIRBE. Kanata, how the heck are you doing?
Man, everything's cool in the game. Like, we're recording at a really good time. The sun is shining, the birds are chirping. I can't really complain about much.
I got no complaints either. This is the time of year where I know a lot of people are missing the NBA, and I miss it to some extent, but like my schedule is actually under control at the moment.
Exactly.
Like I feel like I'm on top of everything I need to be doing, and so I enjoy
You're
it.
sleeping at regular hours, right? Like
I get like 6 hours a night now. It's amazing.
exactly. Like, that's the thing. The season's here. Like, the season's gone. We allow it to be gone. Like, we get to August. We are all very, very happy. All we're doing is just doing our little off-season content. We're actually being full-fledged humans. We talk to people. We get outside. We touch grass. We don't have to worry about the Twitter machine or the X machine or whatever it is. Social media could be just a once in. We put our content out there, and then we just live our lives and we be actual family men. It's a lovely, lovely thing.
Yeah, it's a glorious time of year. But whenever I go through this process, it's at once like, oh, we're here already, and yet you're kind of far away. So it's a very bizarre feeling. The Hornets, though, have had one of the more eventful off seasons without really having this massive churn of on-court personnel, which is kind of like it's hard to have that type of off season. So I want to start with just MJ selling that majority ownership stake in the team to Rick Schnall and Gabe Plotkin. Is this gonna, or do you foresee any changes in how the team operates, whether it's staff changes or what they're doing from a day to day? What can fans expect to, or should they brace themselves for as part of this new ownership regime?
I would start with this. You've already started to see changes in the organization. First one that you obviously notice will be they've been more open about stuff. There's been a lot of behind the scenes changes. I think there's going to be a culture. There's going to be a player personnel culture change. I think there's going to be some changes with a lot of things. I do not expect Mitch Kupchak to stay. I don't expect Steve Clifford to stay. I think this is the last ride for a lot of the Jordan hires. Quite honestly, I think we're headed to a new era in a year. However, the one thing I do want to caution fans with is there's going to be a lot of the same money issues. I still have kind of questions about how much this team is going to spend. Free agency really doesn't exist. So it's more about retaining your own talent. I do kind of wonder, like, there's a lot of this where I do start to wonder, is the money situation going to be any different? Because as you know, as anyone will know, with a quick Google search, Gabe Plotkin is the one that kind of lost his shirt in the GameStop stuff. And he was already a part owner. So there's a lot of this where I still have questions about if the money's going to be different. I don't think it's going to be different, but I do expect a lot of changes behind the scenes.
You mentioned player culture, and you brought up something to me before we recorded that I had, and this is how checked out of the online news cycle I am. The Kai Jones video with the Hornets. What do we make of that? Like, just what are your thoughts? I haven't even been able to form an opinion on it other than I'm watching it and it just kind of breaks your heart a little bit. But
that's the thing. And there's been a lot of online judgment because unfortunately I'm too online even in the off season. But I would say this. One, when we think about the Kai Jones situation, we're talking about a kid that really didn't understand that he was athletically gifted to do basketball until he was 16. A lot of this is recent. A lot of this is just a lot of change. And I think he was closer on the way out than he was on the way in, but he had done just enough to stay on the roster. Again, dunking on Wemby is going to, in Summer League, is going to garner you some grace, some good grace. At the same time, I do hope he's going to get the help he needs. Unfortunately, with this, people want to say he needs to go get help, this, that, and the third. To this point, he has not committed a crime. And until that point, he cannot be forced to go. He can be persuaded to go. He cannot be forced to go. So I hope he gets all the help he needs. Unfortunately, this sounds like, from what I've been told, this has been an all summer thing. So again, it's just one of those things. Like, I hate to say thoughts and prayers to Kai Jones, but I just kind of hope that someone steps in, gets him right, and then we can talk about basketball after that.
No good segue to the actual basketball of this all. What is, for so long, it feels like there's been a disconnect between where people think the Charlotte Hornets should go, where the Charlotte Hornets themselves think they're going. What is this team's direction right now as you zoom out and look at it?
As soon as I figure it out, I'll tell you. But honestly, I do think they've been aiming for the playoffs because I think Mitch has been I think, one, we have to remember that under the Jordan regime, they were one of the more cash poor ownership groups. And so playoffs, like, the goal was always going to be to make playoffs, to fill the coffers, to fill that margin. They might not be like broke, but they operate in a way that basically says we don't really have the money a lot of the time. So that's why the goal was the playoffs. The other thing is, I think Mitch really did believe in his talent, because I think we talked about this 2 years ago, where they had the center rotation of Nick Richards, Vernon Carey Jr., and Miles Plumlee, and a Plumlee brother. And I said, that's a rotation for playoff aspirations as a wish, not necessarily as an actual plan. So I do think this team is aiming for the playoffs. I sneakily like the talent a lot more than I did the last couple of years. Now, granted, there's going to be the guys that disappoint, but I think the direction is playoffs. I also think this is an evaluation year for everybody, because, as already previously stated, Plotkin and Schnall are going to evaluate everybody, see who to keep, who not, and I mean who to keep in the entire building. Much less, like, this can all look very, very different when we have this conversation next year. I think everybody's getting evaluated. So I do think playoff aspirations are necessary to just say, okay, what is this team going to look like when it's competitive? And I think last thing on this, I think last year was an attempt to be competitive, but I also think they thought that the talent was going to be further ahead than it actually was in terms of development, because they've done a pretty decent job of player development. I think they just overestimated how much that player development was going to be without Miles Bridges.
What do you make? And we got here, I'm sure this was the first question everyone thought I'd ask you. What do you make of the Brandon Miller pick? Specifically, of course, choosing him instead of Scoot Henderson.
So I'm going to play a little game. When because Brandon Miller on the Paul George podcast had mentioned that LaMelo had reached out about a month before the draft. If you start taking that kind of tact with it, LaMelo wanted to do that. They kept it close to the vest to probably try to extract as much as they could from Portland to make sure that they got Scoot Henderson, or someone got Scoot Henderson. But the plan was always going to get to Brandon Miller. I had heard Jordan was a big fan of his about a week before the draft. I also kind of think that the star player who took a 5-year deal with no options kind of had his hand in this as well. I do not believe that Scoot Henderson was ever a realistic option. I do believe that at some point, like, they just said, we need a wing. We need a not necessarily a Gordon Hayward replacement, but if we're going to get the closest thing to Paul George, that might be the best way to maximize LaMelo going forward rather than Scoot Henderson, who would shift LaMelo off the ball rather than necessarily and take the ball out of one of probably the top 5 creators in the NBA. Take the ball out of his hands more. I think that was the thought process, and I kind of think LaMelo didn't want Scoot Henderson here anyway.
I think Brandon Miller is still going to be really good. So I want to make that clear. I have some concerns about whether he can generate enough separation on ball, but I also think kind of the beauty of him is he should be able to get his shot up anyway because he's big enough, and he doesn't need to be on the ball to impact the game. So I think he's going to be really good. I just think that's if they're looking at it from the standpoint of, I have a problem when teams say we don't want to take the ball out of LaMelo's hands when we've seen routinely like some of the best teams in the NBA have 2 or 3 really high level creators on the ball, and talent has a way of figuring it out. So I would have, throwing everything else aside, I would have wanted to have seen Scoot and LaMelo play together because I think that they both absolutely could have been optimized while playing together. And I think it just comes down to whether you believe Brandon Miller will be as good or better than Scoot. I personally do not think he's going to be as good or better, but I also think like this could be, I'm not comparing the two, but like we could be looking at, instead of Luka Doncic, they got a Trae Young type deal where it's, hey, you still ended up.
I actually think that was where I was going to go with that. That is exactly where I was going to go with it. The big thing that Brandon Miller, and this is coming from someone that watched every single Brandon Miller game for the last little bit because of work. I think Brandon Miller is going to come in here with a shot better than people expect. I think when you start looking at the Hornets and start looking at the guys that can actually shoot perimeter shots, that can open up the floor more for LaMelo to drive, because we know that LaMelo's finishing numbers are kind of poor. A lot of that is due to poor spacing. I think when you have a guy that can create it, that can't create his own shot yet, but it needs the physical strength to do that, but at the same point comes with an NBA ready 3-point shot where I kind of expect him to shoot 37, 38. I'm not saying 40. But if he shot 38% from 3, would that really surprise you? Because his game is built for that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of this is going to be when you come to Brandon Miller. Before we started the show, I told you, I expect him to be all NBA. I think at least, again, he's got to be all NBA or else the rookie season is a disappointment. I would not be surprised if he's first team all rookie NBA, because I think he's got the skill set and I think he's got the distribution. And the funny thing is, I think he's developed a plan B. I think he's got a plan B already developed because we saw it with the Golden State Warriors summer league game. They doubled him. They threw everything at him. He didn't score, but he had 7 assists. He moved the ball. I want to see what he does with NBA talent. I think he's going to really flash with NBA caliber people on his roster and an actual point guard. Now, granted, he's going to come off the bench to start the season. But at the same point, would it really shock you if he performs well enough late in the season to where Terry Rozier's the 2 guard, the 6 man? It really wouldn't shock me at this point.
I guess, and also, so to that end, when you're talking about a lot of what goes into all rookie and just our first impressions with these rookies, how much are they playing? What does their role look like? The Hornets, and I don't think this has been a bad thing when you look at the way they handle LaMelo, even Mark Williams, just to name like 2 of the more recent ones, even like, PJ Washington earlier in his career. They've brought their youngsters or rookies, it feels like, along more of a gradual track. Yep. What type of a role do you expect Brandon Miller to have in year 1? How do you expect them to use him? Anything along those lines?
7th man, I think he's going to be the second guy off the bench to start. I also have heard he's doing amazing things in these workouts. Now, granted, workouts mean nothing, but he's starting to impress. He's starting to do things. I think the plan is to bring him along slowly. There will not be any Greensboro in his future. And I thank you for bringing up the whole bringing them along slowly, because again, we saw what happened with Mark Williams. When they're ready to go and take on those major minutes. It's always going to be a slow titration. The big thing for at least Brandon Miller for me is going to be, I think he plays the way Cliff likes. I think he's the exception to the rule when it comes to minutes for rookies. Do I think, I mean, it's part of the reason I don't think Kelly Oubre's in town right now, because I think they like the skill set and what he brings. His defense is going to leave a little bit to be desired, but his playmaking skills, his shot making, I think those are all necessary things for the Charlotte Hornets, especially on the bench right now, because you don't know exactly what you're going to get from Cody Martin right now. You don't know if Gordon Hayward is going to come off the bench when Miles Bridges comes back, and we'll talk about that later. But also, a lot of this feels like this kid can do a lot of things really well out the gate, except maybe finish at the rim. And even then, that's going to be an NBA strength thing that's not going to come till year 3. I think he'll be a very, very complimentary piece on a team that's aiming to be in that playing position, if not in the top 6.
I think people sometimes get too caught up with, oh, why isn't this top whatever pick starting as well? Where it's, as you mentioned, him coming off the bench. I want to see more of what he looks like on the ball or what he can do as a facilitator at the NBA. The best spot for him to do that would be, you're going to stagger him from Charlotte starters more than if he was starting with them to begin with. So it wouldn't shock me if he was starting by the end of the year. I might even predict it, but I do feel like some people, and it happens with the Hornets nationally a lot, they're like, why wouldn't you just start LaMelo right out of the gate? They've always brought
that's the funny part. That's the funny part, because James Borrego explained it really well. Like, he's a 19-year-old kid coming in off a pandemic year, not really playing, and then on top of that is expected to be an NBA point guard from jump. There was always going to be a warm-up period for this kid. It was always going to be a slow titration, and the fact that and it's funny because I'm the mixed coaches, because the one thing that Steve Clifford said, and he's very, very right about, as an NBA coach, you do not want to be wrong, because then you lose credibility with the guy. So if you're going to do this slowly, if you're going to build confidence, it allows you a little bit of a margin for error just in case you happen to be wrong, and you can tweak. But it's better to be conservative and then ramp it up than over aggressive, blow the kid's confidence, and now you have to send him to Greensboro to get it figured out.
PJ Washington took roughly an eternity to sign his 3-year, $46.5 million guaranteed deal. Incentives can take it to 48. What do we? First of all, the press conference, that clip with Mitch Kupchak was hilarious. Yes. That was legitimately
that's Mitch's best. Like, here's the thing. That is the highlight of the Mitch Kupchak era in terms of press conferences, because usually they're very, very bad. The fact that he put his business out on Front Street like that was the most amazing thing from Mitch Kupchak. So the PJ Washington thing.
By the way, less spectacular was Mitch Kupchak's explanation of why it took so long. I believe he said something.
Yeah.
His answer was to the effect of, some things take longer than others, which just his response.
Which is basically like, we were not going to pay the 18, because let's be real here. PJ Washington on a 15.5 annual, again, it's basically 15.5 and decreasing in value. If also, we have to remember that is a steal of a contract, because basically you're getting a guy that can guard. I'm not going to say 1 through 5, because 1 through 5 is just generally overrated. But let's say 2 through 4. You got a guy that can guard 2 through 4 for $15.5 million and is probably reaching that point where he's going to be a valuable piece on any kind of playoff team. That is a steal. That is a legitimate steal, and it's a bargain that usually does not happen for the Charlotte Hornets. They squeezed that man. They used every advantage they could with restricted free agency, and basically showed the example of why restricted free agency should probably go away, because theoretically that's a $20 million player on that you got basically for $4.5 million less. And it's also one of those things where he's going to be your starter. He's going to be one of your building blocks now that you have LaMelo. I think he's the third guy of Mitch's own guys that he's actually retained. The first two, LaMelo. The other one, Nick Richards, who you got on a $5 million a year deal when he exploded on the scene, kind of as a backup center. So there's a lot. Like, I kind of like the building pieces. I just wonder where the fit's going to be if Miles Bridges does have his explosive year, like I'm kind of expecting in the back half.
With Miles Bridges, signs a qualifying offer. So I think that's the place to start before looking about what's going to happen when he gets back to on the court. Is there will that be a source of friction between he and the team? Do they still view him as a long-term piece moving forward? He has 10 games left to serve on his
Yep.
suspension for the no contest plea to
Yeah.
felony domestic violence charges, of course. I think it was impossible to come up with, again, I hate making this about the basketball of it after everything that happened last year, but it was impossible to come up with a number for him almost because he doesn't play last year.
Exactly.
And so, like, what do you just make of this and by the way, the other tricky part of this, I saw some people saying, well, he'll just get traded. His rights don't transfer.
Nope.
So no team's going to give you anything to trade for him.
So that's the other thing. And also remember, he's got to want that trade too. That's the other part to this. He's got to want that trade. He's got to sign off on it. So effectively, he's theirs. I think there's partial friction, but I wouldn't say there's that much friction. I think the Hornets do not trust Miles Bridges. I believe that Miles Bridges doesn't trust the Hornets. We're gonna work this out. And typically, when we have because I think Miles Bridges and Clutch were looking for the Jeremy Grant deal. The Jeremy Grant deal was never coming. The Jeremy Grant type deal was never going to come. He plays well. He balls out. The Jeremy Grant deal will be there. I think they're earmarking that money for him already, especially when you consider that Gordon Hayward is going to be a free agent at the end of the year. Now, that's a whole different discussion, but I do think that they're preparing to keep Miles Bridges there. I just want to see what happens. I think there's an agreement. There's a handshake agreement with new ownership, and we'll see again. Do what you do on the floor. Stay out of trouble. Keep your nose clean, and there'll be a deal for you. Now, granted, that's kind of illegal, but again, basically what they're saying is we'll see. I do think there's a deal though coming for him if he happens to hit certain qualifiers.
So we don't need to look at this as he signed his qualifying offer like he's gone. That's not what
I don't think we get there unless things go sideways, which in Charlotte Hornets land is very, very possible.
So what do they, I don't want to get too deep into the rotation stuff just yet, but what do we make of, now they have PJ Washington and Miles Bridges and Gordon Hayward and Mark Williams. Like how are they sort of starting games here? Are you bringing Miles off the bench once he serves his suspension? Are you bringing PJ off the bench? What are you doing here?
I don't expect Miles Bridges to start a game until Christmas. I think him being off free, I think it's also it'd be malpractice to start him off when he's back in 10 after 10 games
for sure
to bring him as a starter straight off. I think it's malpractice. I don't care how much he's been working out over at the local gyms. I do not care. There's a difference between NBA speed and him being away for a year and change, granted of his own doing. But I think you're not going to see him starting until Christmas. I do think that there's going to be a ramp up period. I do think that, and now mind you, this also depends on injuries because again, that's relying on Gordon Hayward staying healthy. That's relying on Terry Rozier staying healthy. Both of those guys have accumulated a decent amount of injuries. We all know about the Gordon Hayward stuff. Start looking at how many games Terry Rozier's played in the last year and a half. There are certain things that work. This rotation can be fluid. I don't know exactly how this is going to go, but my guess is Miles, like I said, wait till Christmas. He'll probably be a starter then. And it brings an interesting question because then it becomes, what do you do with a Terry Rozier? Because do you keep a Gordon Hayward on the bench, save his body for a potential playoff run? But you got to remember, as you said earlier, you need multiple facilitators. That's one of Gordon Hayward's best strengths. So it really does. It's a very fascinating puzzle, and I'm glad I'm not the one that has to solve it and manage the egos at the same time.
Do you think that they're committed at least? Because I think when you look, the other interesting thing about their decisions this offseason, they kind of just punted on saying, we don't need to sign a veteran backup big. We don't need to sign, I'll call it a conventional backup point guard. They let Dennis Smith Jr. go to Brooklyn, and DSJ was good defensively for them anyway.
Defensively, he was good. He was very, very good. I think what they're going with, and I think this was a very, very intentional thing. They saw the Denver Nuggets, and what the Denver Nuggets were we're a big team with a bunch of positional length on defense. That is something, and I believe that is a Steve Clifford move, where he was like, we want to get better. We don't need these tiny guys. It's kind of why I see Terry Rozier being on the move potentially if Cody Martin is healthy. They are aiming to be a big team with a lot of positional length that can defend. That last part is up for debate, but again, that's a Mark Williams problem, and that's a Mark Williams unfortunately, that's what it is. It's like these guys have to dig in and learn to defend. Steve Clifford is really, really good at it, but I think the aim is they're trying to be a big team, lots of length, and occasional positional shoot and decent positional shooting from a PJ Washington, from maybe a Mark Williams, maybe, I don't know. The hand injury might have deterred that, but the aim with that is it's just that big team, positional length, and being better defensively, and they'll figure it out from there.
I'm still assuming, though, I know you've mentioned a big team, and they wouldn't necessarily be the smallest team, but like the way that this roster is built, we're going to see, and they got away from it last year, but like we're going to see PJ at the 5 lineup. Like they just don't have like after Mark Williams and Nick Richards, there's not a ton of bigs.
I don't think we're seeing PJ at the 5 anymore. I don't. Like, I think Nick Richards is done enough.
Well, but that's only 2. Like who you then trust 2 bigs on this team, which is just weird. Like
I get it. I get it. But I think, and it's funny because I remember Cliff telling me this, I want to say almost a decade ago. And he's like, if you want to lose, you go small. He's been on that. This is one thing he's absolutely been on. So when we start talking about big teams, he's not necessarily going to go like, I think he has his 2 bigs he likes. He liked Nick Richards literally before anybody else did. And when Nick Richards did what he did last season, the only people that weren't surprised about it was Steve Clifford and Ty Corbin, the 2 guys that have been working with him. So I think he likes Nick Richards a lot more. I don't think we're going to see PJ at the 5 as much unless you go super, super small and either Mark is in foul trouble or Nick Richards is in foul trouble. I really don't think we're getting there just yet.
I will say I'll be a little bit heartbroken if we don't get the LaMelo plus all 4 wings lineup ever. Like the Washington, Bridges, Miller, Hayward. I would like to see that. To spoil maybe would be my answer to the lineup question. But if they don't do that, I'll almost be impressed if they don't need to lean on that at all. Like not that specific lineup, but I'm just looking at the makeup of this roster and I'm like, okay, Mark Williams, are you just ready for him to play 33 minutes a game?
Yes. They were ready.
Look, he's good.
They were ready. No, they were ready for it last year. You were going to see it if they were in a competitive position last year. They would have, but they weren't. And they were like, yo, we're going to go after these. We're going to see what Book Knight has. We're going to see what Kai Jones has. We're going to see what a lot of these guys have. And instead of that, again, they didn't have much, granted. But at the same point, I think they know what they have in Mark Williams. They're not worried about Mark Williams. The only worry about Mark Williams is the hand injury he suffered. And as long as he's ready to go, I think they're ready to give him the 30 minutes.
So Mark Williams, I very much enjoyed watching last year. Sort of the twofold question with him. And first, we'll start here. What impressed you or maybe surprised you the most about him?
His foot speed. Because I think me and you had this conversation last year where I was significantly concerned about him on the pick and roll and him being the mark that everybody was going to target. He went to Greensboro. They worked with him. The big thing about Mark Williams, and it's one of those things that I will continually harp on, the development staff in Charlotte when it comes to Nick Friedman and the Greensboro Swarm, they do a great job of translating what you need to do from getting in the G League, what's sustainable, what's not. We need to get you this work. Because when Mark Williams was ready to go, he was ready to go. He is going to start. And quite honestly, like I said, the foot speed was there. The defensive IQ was a lot better than I thought it would ever be. And the fact that, he was, because again, I was a Doran guy. I think we talked about this. I was a Doran guy. I was hardcore Doran guy. I was stoked that we got him. And then When they traded him, I was very, very upset. Now, granted, that pick turned into Nick Smith Jr., who we'll talk about later. But I was really, and I understood what Mitch and I think Cliff were thinking about with this, which was we need positional length. We need a big guy that can move his feet. We need a deep guy with defensive IQ because if you've seen the Hornets for longer than maybe 48 minutes, you already know the defensive IQ was lacking on this team and has been lacking since Marvin Williams left the building. So therefore, you needed that guy, and the only thing that you were worried about was athleticism. He covered up those athletic things. And I think if you look at him in the mold of a Brook Lopez, it works so well.
The way that they got him to turn his body and how he was moving his feet from there on defense, we had talked about, I thought he was too slow. I remember when we were talking last year. So that really impressed me. Even the little floater he would bust out or having testing out the mid-range, what are you watching aside from the, you said he had hand surgery, I think it was, or finger surgery this offseason. Just aside from that, what are you going to be watching from him most in year two? What fascinates you the most?
I want to see if he develops that three, because there were rumblings that they were going to try and develop that three. If he develops a three, this unlocks everything, because now you can play 5 out. And you saw the mid-range. The mid-range was kind of solid.
I bought into it. I'm sold.
So if he develops that three, and granted, the rumors with Hornet centers developing threes, because Lord knows, everyone was telling me Cody Zeller would be able to hit a three, this, that, and the third. If Mark Williams hits a three, we're talking about Brook Lopez 2.0. And that kind of building block at 15, at the 15th pick in the draft, is something that when you talk about Mitch Kupchak and his legacy as the GM here, you're going to have to bring up the fact that he found all these gems in the late lottery and beyond.
I'm actually, this might be too nerdy, but there's two things I'm watching with him. And we're talking about the foot speed. The way that they have him turning his body right now, it makes it tougher for him to cover both ends of the pick and roll, when he's not playing straight up. So, and I do think that hurt his rim protection numbers a little bit. They kind of evened out towards the end when he started playing a bigger role. But I'm watching that. So I'd be curious your thoughts on that. And the second thing is, I think when he's making catches on after slipping screens or on those short rolls, I want to see, especially now that he should have more shooting around him, if that shot isn't immediately available, can he make the decision of, is there a one dribble decision there? Or what I'm more fascinated by, hey, can I hit the guy in the corner? Can I hit the guy on the behind the arc? And that's, I don't know what the word is. I'm very curious to see if we can see
his decision making. His one bounce decision making. Yeah, I get that one. The funny thing is, I'm not worried about that part. That part, him offensively, I am not worried about. Defensively, I would also like to say I'm not really that worried about, because the people that are going to get him right, Steve Clifford, Ty Corbin, they are really good at what they do in terms of getting defenders right. We saw Dennis Smith Jr. turn into a defensive dog under Steve Clifford. Cliff in defense is the one thing I do not worry about with this team. This team was actually one of the better defensive teams. Granted, how much of that you take seriously after the All-Star break, because we know they don't really try after the All-Star. Folks don't really try. But the fact that they were top 10 in defense post All-Star break, I think that part kind of matters. So I'm not necessarily worried about the defensive aspects, because I think a lot of that coaching defensively was done on the fly. And I think with a full offseason, I think there are going to be a lot more wrinkles to Mark Williams' game, especially on defense.
I can't believe it took us this long to get here, but the response to the LaMelo extension was actually a little bit more divisive than I thought.
I don't understand that one, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to just ask you, what were your impressions on the reaction to the LaMelo extension? Not the LaMelo extension, which I look at as a straight max, all NBA language like normal, and no player options. I viewed that as an organizational win.
That is. That's the thing. It's a win. There's no player options. It becomes a question of how long does it become before LaMelo gets tired and he asks out? He's going to get his money regardless. They're going to get the player regardless. It's a 2.5-year deal, I think. And I think, and also, again, like I said, I think part of this is tied to not drafting his potential replacement in Scoot Henderson. You make the guy happy. He doesn't want to take any options. He's very, very happy here for right now. You take that and you run. And I do believe that a lot of this, like, I get the slings and arrows at Mitch Kupchak for a lot of these things. I also would probably caution that he's working with one hand tied behind his back because the previous owner would like to meddle and dip in and dip out every now and again and get his guys, especially when you start reading reports of wanting to offer guys like Montrezl Harrell big money for little prices, and then eventually Montrezl Harrell shows up and doesn't do much here. So I would just say this. The LaMelo thing is a win, and anyone that tries to basically spin it as anything else, I'm kind of laughing at you right now, and I'm laughing very, very hard.
Brian Windhorst calls this the fun max, and I think I would just agree with. And it's like what you had said is I think what you essentially did is you bought yourself an extra year here before you had to make a decision, because you can say 2.5 years, but like everything is now moved to, if they have 2 years left on their deal, like 2 guaranteed years, they have leverage. And so by not having that player option, you've ensured, hey, we have 4 more years of LaMelo technically, because he still has the 1 year left on his rookie scale before, if we're willing for things to get awkward or not just acquiesce, 4 years to figure it out. That's a critical amount of time.
Exactly. Like he can't he can bang the table and say, I want out, but the Hornets don't necessarily have to acquiesce, like you said.
Damian Lillard's finding that out right now.
Exactly. Like literally, they're going to get a decent amount of value for whenever he wants out, if he wants out, unless they build something significant here. And I believe they are to a point. I do think that this organization has done some dumb things. Mitch Kupchak is not a dumb man. He just, on occasion, over believes in his talent. And that's not, if that's the worst thing he does, I can't really be mad at him.
What last year when we spoke and LaMelo barely plays, dealing with all those injuries, you were going to be monitoring sort of his strength and finishing around the basket. Is that the biggest thing you're watching as he goes into year 4?
Yeah.
Still?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But the funny thing is he became the best scorer he on a scoring level in those 30 games that he played. He was a much, much better scorer. And I'm kind of like, I know Matt Moore did the whole thing on the top 100 players, and he put him at 84. And I wasn't going to fight it because, quite honestly, the Hornets hadn't done enough to where it was worth defending. So, but if LaMelo comes out with a decent amount of strength and stays healthy, he's going to remind a lot of people about exactly how good he is. I believe in the kid. I just want to see him get some better footwear. That's just me. And I understand he's got the Puma thing. I just want him to have decent sneakers, have decent footwear, and play 60, 70 games, because he's been so snake bit with these injuries that are not his fault, that I just want to see him play 70 games. Just give me 70 games, and then we'll see where we're at after that.
I think, and just to stray away, I think that's the biggest thing for him. And also the strength thing, I really do believe would allow him to do more defensively. And I understand how they use him now. Part of that goes into it is the load he carries on offense. He's not very strong. You also want him to be in position to go after defensive rebounds so you get your possession started. But I look at him, and just based off what we've seen, even though they don't have him gambling a ton and shooting gaps, he can be so disruptive. If he's a little bit stronger, I feel like this is someone who can actually make a meaningful on-ball defensive impact is what I'm getting at.
I do think that's possible. I do think that's possible. I just think that we're a while from that. It's also that's one of those areas that I would not be surprised if it changes organizationally, where the strength training, whatever the new staff looks like, I would not be surprised if there is a true NBA caliber strength training program here, because I think that's been a critical concern. If you start thinking about going back to, hell, even Malik Monk, like
Mhm.
guys that have struggled to put on weight here in Charlotte and have flourished elsewhere with as they get older with proper strength training programs. I do think that's something that I expect to change as we go forward in the Plock and Chenal era.
I know exceedingly little about Nick Smith Jr. What is the cliff notes on his game, and can we expect to see him do anything with the bigger club in year one?
I will say this. There were like there were moments in summer league where he did some things and he scored. And granted, he was expected to be the point guard, and I think he's woefully out of position. I will also point out that when it came to the Green, because I kind of expected him to be in Greensboro for a long swath of this season. The one thing I will point out is that when it came to promote the Greensboro Swarm, there were two players on there. One, Leaky Black, who I do think is going to organizationally matter at some point. It probably won't be this year. The other was Amari Bailey, but Nick Smith was nowhere to be seen on that. I think Nick Smith has a chance to break into this rotation if he defends. If he defends, I think he's one of those guys that can be a Jeremy Lamb type player where he gives you 15, 17, 18 off the bench. I think he's going to push guys like Cody Martin. I think he's also going to push guys like Bryce McGowan's, who sneakily had a half decent season. There's a lot of competition for those backup wings. There's a glut of those backup wings. And again, we haven't even mentioned James Bouknight, who might be closer to out on this rotation, out on this roster than in. I think there's a chance that he does do something this year, but I do think that it's going to take a little bit. I think functionally he's not a 1. He's going to have to be a 2. And if he ends up being Jordan Clarkson 2.0, I wouldn't be surprised.
I feel like if that is what they were looking for, I'd probably prefer Bryce McGowan's. I guess I just like if
you need those bucket getters. Charlotte was one of the worst scoring teams last year, and they have historically struggled to score. You need those bucket getters. And if you trust your bigs to be defensively sound, and you trust that, again, a JT Thor, who I think they believe in a lot, which is why they were so eager, not necessarily eager, but they were so willing to get rid of a guy like Jalen McDaniels.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you trust the positional defensive intensity and length of those two guys, I think you can live with a Bryce McGowan's at the 2. Again, a potential Ntilikina, Frankie Smokes, backup point guard. If Brandon Miller's starting and if they make a move, they make a Terry Rozier move, like him, Nick Smith Jr., you find a spot for McGowan to play. And then if your backup five guys are Ntilikina, Nick Smith Jr., McGowan's, JT Thor, Nick Richards, I think they're going to be willing to take those gambles with guys like that. It's just going to take a lot of rotation. It's going to take a lot of rotational churn, because I do think that a move is going to be made by February at this point.
There is, and you sort of mentioned all the players that we haven't talked about in depth on this podcast. Is there anyone from that group that you're either particularly interested in long-term, or who you just see someone on this roster playing a much bigger role than expected next season?
I think Cody Martin, I think a lot of people that
Forgot
were saying
how good he was.
Forgot how good he was. And they said they kept the wrong Martin twin. And I vehemently disagree. I think Cody Martin under Steve Clifford, if he's healthy, is going to give you exactly what Caleb Martin gave you. And that kind of rotational piece, especially for the price that we both were like, holy crap, he signed for that. I think Cody Martin's going to be a lot better than people think, especially if that knee is right. If that knee is right, then you're talking about a guy that I'm not saying will be all defensive, but I think he might get votes. I think he could get votes. A couple of votes here, scant votes here or there. I think he's that good.
I also think, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but like we had talked about, okay, their decision not to sign a veteran. Well, I mean, they signed Frank Ntilikina, but an actual floor general type player. Cody Martin can do that. Like that's something else that he can do.
Yeah, there's that, and I think long term they're looking at Amari Bailey, and
Okay.
I think Amari Bailey, who did have some moments of okay, he can be a point guard, and there some other moments where it was straight yikes. Um, I do believe that Amari Bailey might be the backup point guard of the future. They're trying to develop him in that. Yeah. So I think going there is probably, I would probably say that. I don't think they believe in backup point guards that much. That's probably a Jordan thing. I wouldn't be surprised if that changed in a year where Rich Nall. And I also think that they have enough pieces to where if it's really a problem, you can give up a James Bouknight who again will probably be in the last year of his deal. They have a decent amount of expiring salaries to where they can make a deal and get rid of folks if they need to.
Who has a bigger impact for this team, LaMelo Ball or Frank Ntilikina?
It's LaMelo Ball, slight gap, and then it's Frank Ntilikina.
I'll accept that answer. So this, you had kind of mentioned it already. Charlotte finished like a bear on defense last year. They were 8th in points allowed per possession after the trade deadline. When you look at it, they did all the things that a Steve Clifford team typically does. Is there anything stylistically about their defense that you think flies under the radar, or even when looking at the makeup of this team, that makes you believe they can sustain that success over a longer period leading into this season?
I think you're going to get a lot of. I think the one thing that I would note is that Charlotte was playing with a lot of replacement level guys to start the season. If you start really looking at it, LaMelo didn't play for a lot. Terry Rozier was their best player for a large swath until Christmas, until Hayward got back. Hayward got hurt. Everything else. I don't think we've seen the proper Charlotte Hornets team yet. Now, granted,
No, we
there are
haven't.
a lot of guys,
Especially on offense, I would say too.
Exactly. I don't think we've seen it. I think if you're wondering, okay, what are we doing? What are they going to do on defense? A lot of this is we haven't seen this team properly put together in, I would say, since the exit in Atlanta, since the play-in tournament exit in Atlanta. This team has not properly been put together. I guess that's where it is. Like that's it. Like this team, when this team gets healthy, and that's a really big question, is if this team is going to get healthy, because they haven't been healthy for 3 years. But what I'm saying is, health-wise, and I'm excluding Gordon Hayward from this conversation because we all know he's going to play about 55 games and that's it. I do believe that this team, when 90% put together, I think this team defensively is going to be a load on defense. And I think Steve Clifford got a lot of buy-in in that back half of the season. So I think they're coming in there, bought in, and there's not going to be any infighting.
Is there like any concern though about now all of a sudden, let's say LaMelo is going to play in 60-something games rather than 30-something. You have a rookie in Brandon Miller that's going to be out there. You're welcoming Miles Bridges back at some point. Is there any concern about, by bringing back the full strength Hornets, that you're potentially a little flimsier defensively?
I'm not worried. I'm not as worried about that, because the one thing we've done, like Steve Clifford can hide a weak defender. Steve Clifford has. I've seen Steve Clifford use Michael Kidd-Gilchrist to hide the flaws of Kemba Walker and a whole lot of other guys on defense. I have all the faith in the world that he's got 2 legitimate defenders in PJ Washington starting, and he's also got, again, PJ Washington, Cody Martin, Mark Williams. We'll throw Nick Richards in there as a rim protecting threat. There are a few guys. Bryce McGowan's is going to get better at that on that aspect. I think there's a lot of guys that are going to be better because Steve Clifford's going to be in their ear. He's going to teach them how to play defense. I think Miles Bridges might be the biggest beneficiary of Steve Clifford coaching him. So there's a lot of this where I think, let me just see where we are in camp. I'm very optimistic about the defense because I've seen Cliff work magic before. I mean, he hid Al Jefferson as the big, and Al Jefferson had hard time guarding you or me. And they ended up winning 48 games with that. So I've seen Cliff work magic. I'm not worried about it as much.
Looking at the current roster construction, do you think that there's any under the radar strengths this team is going to have, or what's something about them that just is flying under the national radar right now?
I think this is going to be a better perimeter shooting team than it was last year. I think we're going to get back to 43 and 39 team. I don't think we're ever going to see the pace again because Cliff hates playing at that pace. They're going to find a happy medium. They're going to be better in the half court this year. I think with another shooter, I think with also guys that can score, they're going to be better in the half court. They were horrible in the half court last year. A lot of that due to injury, but I do think half court wise, I think they're going to be better than people think. And outside of that, I think defensively, like I think they're going to end up proving that last year's All-Star break wasn't a fluke.
Yeah, the defense, I'm just going to be fascinated to see sort of how that progresses with this team. Is there a concern or thought from the offseason that we haven't hit yet about the squad?
What happens if Mark Williams misses time? I think they've built
some 5. We solved it already, I thought.
Well, what happens if Mark Williams misses time might be my biggest concern. I'm like, there is going to be the whole what happens if LaMelo's gone. I'm not worried as much about that because, well, you have I think Miles Bridges eventually will take that being the best half-court scorer on the team that he was when they were 43 and 39, I'm sorry. But I do wonder what happens if they don't have their center, the defensive stalwart. Are we going to go back to a team that gave up a boatload of points in bunches? I like Nick Richards. I think Nick Richards is perfectly suited as a backup center right now. But what happens if Kai Jones has to get minutes? What happens if, God forbid, something happens and they have to trade for it? They have to use their disposable income, their expiring contracts for a center, for a backup center, or something like that. The center position is a strength, but it's still a weakness because if Mark Williams misses any time, all of this stuff we talked about on defense is going to probably fall apart.
So are you ready for the cookie cutter portion of the podcast?
Let's do it.
What does this 10-man rotation look like this year?
I'm not sure it's 10 men. I'm not sure it's 10.
Well, if we had to break it down
starters right now, probably, and we got to remember, we got to do this in like 3 different portions. The Miles Bridges list portion, we have to do this with Miles Bridges, and then what will probably be the lineup come February. So to start this out, it'll probably be LaMelo, Terry. My guess is Gordon Hayward still starts, PJ, and Mark Williams. And then on top of that, first guy off the bench probably ends up being Cody Martin. It'll be a Cody Martin, Cody Martin, Brandon Miller, JT Thor, and Nick Richards. They believe in JT Thor. That's the one guy I think we're not talking about enough, is that I think JT Thor is probably going to get more burn than people think because he can defend multiple positions. He's a 6'11" guy. Now, granted, defensively, he's better than defensively, he's going to be better than he is on offense. But if he hits a couple of threes, if he does at least a little bit of damage, if he's a floor spacer, he's going to be very, very good. And then the 5th, maybe Bryce McGowan's, maybe a Nick Smith Jr. I'm not sure it matters as much at this point right now.
Yeah, I mean, I love JT Thor. Watching him, it's like coordinated chaos, almost organized chaos, whatever. So I guess Miles Bridges comes back. Who's going to be like the odd man out there?
There's a theory that is Gordon Hayward. I don't necessarily subscribe to that theory. My guess is that Gordon Hayward, because of the fact that he's probably at worst your 4th or 5th best perimeter defender, and I stress this, at the worst, is probably going to stay on the starting lineup. I wouldn't be surprised if it's PJ Washington that comes off the bench because he's done that before. I think that's the way they go with that. And then it becomes a Cody, your first three off the bench, PJ Washington, Cody Martin, and Brandon Miller. And that's a pretty strong 8 right there, provided everybody stays healthy. And then I do think that at some point, if Brandon Miller pops, that's when the conversation about Terry Rozier has to happen. And that may be a conversation where he pops in December, or he pops in January, pops in February. And then you're going to have start having those conversations, because I think it's coming faster than we think. I just don't think it's going to be one of those. I don't think the thing with Brandon Miller, and I know we already talked about it to death, but I think it's just a functional strength thing. But there are things that he can do. And if he's a dead-eye perimeter shooter for this team, there's a role for him where he can do that and distribute and be just fine.
Question is always somewhat matchup dependent, but let's fast forward to February. What do you think will be their preferred closing lineup? Is it just going to be the starters, or is there going to be room to futz and fiddle there?
Cody Martin, just wherever. I think LaMelo, Cody Martin, Miles Bridges, PJ Washington, Mark Williams. I think Terry Rozier. I think they mess with Terry Rozier on and off. They do some offense defense things with Terry Rozier, because I think defensively Terry Rozier has limitations because of his size.
What is a weirdo, quirky, unconventional lineup you'd like to see them try?
Again, you stole the LaMelo and all wings one, but I don't think that's coming. Actually, I got it. Bridges, let's see, Ball, Bridges, Washington, Thor, Mark Williams.
Okay, I'd be here for it. Mine was way too similar. I thought I was going to have you because I had, until you started talking about JT Thor at the end. It's LaMelo plus all wings, but like JT Thor is in there. So I have LaMelo. We'll go. I want to see Brandon Miller, JT Thor, PJ Washington, and I think Miles Bridges as the fifth in there. You could go with Gordon Hayward if you really wanted to, but that would be a lineup I'd love to see.
I think because of the center, the only thing is, I know Cliff is not the biggest fan of PJ Washington at center. I know that for a fact. But at the same point, I can easily see that one too.
Why don't we'll call it JT Thor at center then? Will that make Cliff feel a little bit better about it?
Because have you seen him try to hold bigs off? Once you see that, you'll understand why.
The Hornets' current win total over under is set at 24.5.
That's way too low.
That is definitely a typo now that I'm thinking about it. Hold on.
I was about to say,
there's no way it was that low. I think I might have accidentally put the Wizards one in for them.
No problem. I think it's 29.5. I think it's 20.
It's 30.5 at the moment.
30.5.
Okay. But their 24.5 was way too low. Are you going with the over or the under on that? And where do you see them kind of stacking up in the larger context of the East?
Last year, when I said I'm not worried about losing Bridges, I was a little too arrogant. I think they hit over, but I think it's because this team, again, won 26 games, and they only got 36 games combined from Ball and Bridges. This team, I think, has enough talent to get over 30 if you get enough. If you get 40, I'll put it this way. If you get 50 games from LaMelo Ball, you get 50 games from at least 50 games from Miles Bridges. You get maybe 40-ish games from Gordon Hayward. Like, I'm not expecting much, but if you get a respectable amount of games from that roster, I think they'll win over 30. If you give me 60 games of LaMelo and a boatload of health, I think it's possible. Keyword, I think it's possible that they get top 6. I think this team is very similar to a Cleveland team that just needed that one last piece, which was Evan Mobley. And I think they can compete for top 6. It's just, I just wonder about the maturity of this team, but I'm also thinking that Cliff is a perfect guy to instill this before he moves on to probably what is a front office position.
It's going to be a tough one when we go through our over-unders here for me, because like you said, they won 27 last year with less than ideal health and just like obliterated availability from certain guys.
Yeah.
And there's more talent on this roster. So if they're even a modicum of better health, they should win way more. But I'm wondering if there's like the potential, do they trade out of some of their rotation players? The East is also kind of, there are other teams where I don't know how to feel about them. Like, what do the Pistons look like this year? What are the Magic doing? What are the Wizards? We know the Wizards will probably be the worst team in the conference, but it's so jumbled towards like the middle of the East. I don't know where to place them.
Here's the thing about where I wonder. Like, I love Lazarus Jackson. I know he's listening to this right now. I wonder about where Detroit is going to be. I'm not necessarily worried about them. I'm very curious about where Orlando is going to be in a year, this year. I'm much more curious about what Atlanta is going to be, because Atlanta looks like a train wreck somewhat. I'm very worried. Like, there's a lot of this. What does Philly look like? Does Philly take a step back?
Like, I just forgot Philly's a basketball team at this point is really where I'm at.
Exactly. So we're talking about a lot. Like, I think having the talent that they have right now, they can take advantage if they stay healthy. And it's a year you're not introducing a new coach. You're not having all this chaos of a trial or anything else like that. This is just about basketball this year. This team can focus on basketball. There's no on the court, off the court stuff. There's no coaching hire. This is the same guy in the same program. And these guys know what's expected of them for the most part. And the rookie is not expected to contribute that much to this. This team is going to be better than people think. I'm going to say this repeatedly. They're going to be better. Do I think they're an automatic playoff team? If everything pops right, but everything doesn't always pop right, especially in Charlotte. But I expect them to be in the playoff playing race, because I have a lot of questions about everybody. Quite honestly, after 5 or 6, like, I do have questions about a Indiana team that is expected to do a lot with Jarris Walker and everything that they've put together. I do have questions about Chicago. I have a lot of questions about a lot of those teams, even Toronto. Mm-hmm. Like, I have a lot of questions, and I wonder if the Hornets, because of the continuity and because of the bunker mentality that they kind of have right now, or at least it appears that they have right now, I wonder if they come out and surprise everybody.
Yeah, they're in a weird, this will come off as an insult, but the only team I'm prepared to say they'll definitely be better than is Washington. Mm-hmm. But I could probably go through a list of 5 to 7 teams that they feel like, could they be better than the Nets? Absolutely. Bulls, Raptors, of course. Like, so the list.
I'm not prepared to do the Nets yet. I'm not prepared to do the Nets, because I think the Nets and I believe in Jock Vaughn's coaching capability. Bulls and Raptors, absolutely. Give me those 3 teams. Wizards, Raptors, Bulls. I feel confident about those 3.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, for me, the Bulls, at least one of the Bulls or Raptors, that has to bake in they became sellers, because one of those teams, as constructed, should be better than the Hornets right now. And if they're not, I'm assuming a catastrophic injury has happened.
I think the one thing that we have to remember is that there are guys on this roster. There's always a guy. Last year was Nick Richards that took the next step after 3 years. Is it JT Thor? If he takes there's at least one guy. Is it Bryce McGowan's? Is Brand I think Brandon Miller is going to be better than people think year one. I do think the strength is going to be an issue, but I think skill-wise and basketball IQ-wise, he does so many different things so well that he can't help but make an impact on this team. I think this team is incredibly talented. It's literally the health issue for me. If they stay healthy, if LaMelo plays 60 games, I think they're going to win closer to 40, 44, 45 than they will down to 31, 32.
Is there anything we have not discussed that you think needs to be hit about this team?
No, I think we spanned the gamut on this one. I think we've spanned the entire gamut.
In that case, are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you?
You can find me. You can find me.
Thoughts?
Yeah. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Blue Sky, not at Scribe. They're all the same thing. Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever. There is a social media. If you really want to hear the stuff I do the Eye on College Basketball podcast. I work for CBS. I produce a bunch of podcasts for CBS Sports. And largely, if you want to hear my thoughts, you would just follow me on Twitter. That's about it.
The link to his Twitter, and I'll try and find his Blue Sky. I don't know if I should follow you. Hopefully I do. Will be in our description. Kanata, this is always a genuine joy. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your insight. As you know by now, I will be pestering you again in the future.
Of course, man. Look forward to having this conversation this year and figure out how wrong I was this time.